Okay, I turned around because the sun was too hard, making it hard to see. I'm still reading our Lewis and Clark book. We're now on chapter 8, and the title of this chapter is Into the Unknown. That would be a little bit scary. These guys were really brave. Into the Unknown. During the first months of their journey, the captains had maps to follow. They also had gotten advice from white traders who had traveled the Missouri. But once the expedition left Fort Mandan, it would be different. Lewis and Clark would be entering lands known only to the Native Americans. The explorers had gotten some help from the Hidatsa before they left Fort Mandan. The Hidatsa had told them that they would need horses to cross the mountains. There was no other way. Horses, they said, could be bought from the Shoshone. As the explorers set out upstream, a squad of soldiers and rivermen would return downstream in the keelboat. Packed into the keelboat were 9 boxes of items for President Jefferson. These included the skins, skeletons, horns, and antlers of many of the animals that the explorers had come upon. There was even a live prairie dog. In a report he had prepared for the president, Lewis wrote that he expected to reach the Pacific that summer. He was hopeful that the expedition might be able to return to Fort Mandan for the winter of 1805 or 1806, or from 1805 to 1806, excuse me. He said to Jefferson, "You may therefore expect to see me in Monticello," which was the name of Jefferson's plantation, "in September 1806. Once the explorers were underway, they found the river to be their enemy. Because of sandbars and the strong current, the men often had to push the boats. That meant wading in freezing water that was shoulder deep. Oh, can you imagine getting into freezing water this high up on your body? Ooh, that sounds terrible. Sometimes the river bottom was thick with mud. The men had to slog their way through. Other times, the bottom was covered with sharp stones that cut into their moccasins. Using tow ropes, the men had to haul the boats upstream from the shore. It was always cold. Even in May, snow fell and ice formed at night in their kettles and saucepans. Clark's journal entry for May 2nd, 1805 reads, "A very extraordinary climate, to behold the trees green and flowers spread on the plains, and snow an inch deep." Fortunately, there was plenty to eat. Day after day, the explorers sighted herds of deer, elk, and buffalo. There was one animal they did not hunt. That was the grizzly bear. The Hidatsa had warned the captains that the grizzly was a fierce animal with great strength. This made the explorers cautious and curious. "The men, as well as ourselves, are anxious to meet these bears," Lewis wrote. One day, not long after the expedition had crossed from the present state of North Dakota into Montana, they got their wish. Lewis and one of the soldiers were walking along the riverbank when they spotted 2 grizzlies. Each man quickly fired and hit a bear. One of the wounded animals ran off. The other charged Lewis, who turned and fled. Oh my goodness. The wounded bear could not keep pace. That gave Lewis time to reload and shoot again. The soldier fired too. Together, they managed to kill the animal. On May 26, 1805, Lewis climbed low hills along the riverbank and from them caught his first glimpse of the snow-covered Rocky Mountains far in the distance. He wrote that he felt a secret pleasure at finding himself so close to the source of the Missouri River. At the same time, he reflected on the difficulties this snowy barrier would probably throw in my way and the sufferings and hardships that were to follow. On June 3rd, 1805, the explorers came upon a fork in the river that confused them. "An interesting question was now to be determined," wrote Lewis. "Which of these rivers is the Missouri?" Making the right choice was vital. A chief goal of the expedition was to trace the Missouri to its source. If the explorers took the wrong branch of the river, they would end up wasting weeks of valuable travel time. The northern branch of the river was brown and muddy like the Missouri. Most of the men felt certain that the northern branch was the right one. Lewis and Clark didn't agree. They believed that the South Fork was the one they should follow because it was clear and had a clean, stony bottom. It seemed obvious that it had come from a distant mountain source. The captains explored the two streams. That made them more certain than ever that the South Fork was part of the Missouri. Lewis was so sure that the North Branch was not the Missouri that he gave it a name. He called it Maria's River, after a cousin back home. It still has that name today, but without the apostrophe. Their goal now was to follow the South Fork until they came to the Great Falls of the Missouri. The waterfalls had been described to them by the Hidatsa at Fort Mandan. The captains decided to split up. Boy, that must have been a very hard decision to make. On June 11th, Lewis set out overland to find the falls. Clark stayed behind with most of the men and the boats. 2 days later, Lewis was the first to reach the Great Falls. He heard the falls before he saw them. His journal entry for June 13th reads, "My ears were saluted with the agreeable sound of a fall of water, and advancing a little further, I saw the spray arise above the plain like a column of smoke." There could be no doubt now. The captains had chosen the right river to follow. Lewis described the falls as a sublimely grand spectacle, the grandest sight I ever beheld. While the falls were a natural wonder of startling beauty, they also presented a great problem. Lewis soon found that there was not one great falls, which was what he had been told by the Hidatsa, but instead there were 5 of them. They were linked by stretches of the river in which the water ran very fast. It was clear that the explorers would have to abandon the river and travel by foot. They would have to travel overland almost 18 miles. The terrain was steep and rocky with thick patches of prickly pear cactus. The men set to work building a pair of 4-wheeled wagons to carry their canoes and supplies. Lewis called them trucks. Not long after sunrise on June 22nd, 1805, the trip around the Great Falls began. It was back-breaking work. The men were pounded with cold rain and hailstones the size of eggs. Okay, now, boys and girls, we get hail here sometimes, right? Imagine if those hailstones were the size of eggs. It's like this big. That's crazy. And big gnats and mosquitoes pestered them. They had to grasp rocks and clumps of grass in hauling the wagons up the steep slopes. The cactus cut their feet. The cottonwood wheels cracked and split. Long stops had to be made for repairs. Lewis noted that the men became so exhausted that at every halt, they would fall asleep in a moment. The men had to make 4 trips overland in order to carry their 6 large dugout canoes around the falls. By the 4th of July, the explorers had completed their difficult trek around the Great Falls. Now they could put their canoes back in the water again. In the evening, they paused to celebrate the nation's 29th birthday. Our United States of America was only 29 years old at that point. Cruzat played the fiddle. The men, wrote Lewis, continued their mirth with songs and festive jokes and were extremely merry until late at night. And that is the end of chapter 8. But I want to show you this picture of the falls. And the caption reads, "Even today, the Great Falls of the Missouri are no place for small boats." And here's what it looks like. Try Googling the Great Falls of the Missouri River and see what you can see. What do they look like now? What does it look like today? Okay, have fun with that. Bye.